Hi everyone, this is Paradox2767 again. I've been listening to a lot of Presley, go figure, from a CD my wife just picked me up today. It's pretty great. She found it in a rummage, and what that inspired was a little bit of pondering over the movie Lilo and Stitch. So today I'm making a bit of a Lilo and Stitch diorama model, but basically it's just an excuse for me to talk about Elvis again and to think about him a little bit more while I listen to the music in the background. I had to find my two action figures from when I was really young in an old bin that we still have around for my niece. I found those, put those aside, and we were ready to begin. So I decided to make this model based on the rocket we see Stitch riding. So for the body of that, I'm going to use an old soda bottle, plus a couple other pieces we had lying around the house. I'm cutting a hole there to make sure our characters fit. Then for the bottom of it, I'm going to take another soda can and sort of connect it that way. Using that same glue I used for the last model a few days ago, and it doesn't work very well. I found out for this type of work, especially I think putting plastic to metal and so forth, but I tried it anyway and it ended up turning out okay. So there I'm kind of shaping the general rocket with the stuff I did have laying around, putting a couple earbuds there for the thrusters in the back, which you won't end up seeing too much in the model itself. I just used a screw and some pieces like that for the front. Then it was a matter of adding some fins from a bit of cardboard, and pretty soon the rocket was sort of taking shape. If you're interested in hearing a review on Elvis or in seeing a model I made based on Elvis, you can check out my channel for those. I put that review together after having seen the movie twice, and I say in there that I need to take a break at that point from Elvis. Well, that was filmed less than a week ago, and I've already seen it twice more since, so I caved. I'm at 4 in-theater viewings at this point, which is a personal record, one that I don't expect to break. I don't expect to see it anymore, but I guess I can't say that with such confidence at this point. I knew I wanted to color it. I was going to paint it at first, so for that I wanted to put a base coat on it. Unfortunately, I couldn't for the life of me open our paint can because of its age, so I had to kind of cut a hole in the side of it because I figured now is as good a time as any to use that paint up, and that's what I did. So I didn't have a paintbrush. The one I used in the last video I neglected to clean, so it was petrified. Instead I used a toothbrush because I sort of thought maybe a brush is a brush. I was seeing new things about the movie as it went on. One thing I liked is how it's kind of bookended with some similar themes. For instance, Elvis, right on his first road trip, is in a motel and calls back home and tells his mother he's just sort of bored and isn't having all the raucous fun she expects him to be while on the road. Well, that bookended nicely with his, life in Las Vegas, where he's basically doing the same thing, spending a lot of time in solitary confinement in a hotel. And so I thought that was a nice kind of theme throughout, a sad one, but those seem to bookend the film well. I also liked how in Priscilla's first scene, she says something to Elvis to the effect of, if you can dream it, you can do it. It's sort of a philosophy she comes up with on the fly while they're talking. And she goes ahead and says that again in their final scene when they're in the back of a car together, a scene that I liked a lot in my review as well. So she says the same thing in her first and final scenes, though in a way they mean the opposite. In the first time she says, if you can dream it, you can do it. And it's her telling Elvis that he can do whatever he sets his mind to. And she's trying to convince him to shoot for the stars, basically, with his career. At the end, she's actually trying to convince him to check into a kind of a resting home or maybe a sort of a rehab, just so he can cleanse his body and heal a little bit. And she says, if you can dream it, do it, because he doesn't know whether or not he can sort of stop making music with all the contracts and things he's got wrapped up in Vegas. But she says, instead of being famous, if you can dream it, do it. She's saying, hey, stop being famous. If you can dream that you'll be a healthy, fulfilled person, you can do it. So she's saying the opposite, while at the same time, obviously repeating herself. So I covered it all in, I guess what you'd call a base coat or primer or something, and sort of got that to sort of stick together there at the front and put that aside to dry. Because I'm so impatient, I try to speed that drying process with a hair dryer, as you see there. And it sort of worked and was ready for a little bit more shaping and paint. Put a lot of paint on though, so it was destined to take a while to dry. Then for a sort of base, I decided to use a hanger and shape it so that I could uphold the rocket itself while at the same time making it look like exhaust was coming out. So I wrapped that in some wire, which would end up not working, spoiler alert, I'd accidentally break the simple lighting fixture I have there, and without any talent for that sort of thing, I was unable to rewire it. But the exhaust itself still worked out fine, so I used some cotton for that. Basically, the premise of this model is there's a point in the movie where Stitch tries to hop in a rocket and take it off to dominate the world, but it's just a little toy rocket that you put a quarter in and shake back and forth for a little bit. But I wanted to basically make a model of what Stitch would have wished that rocket could be, and if that makes any sense at all. So basically, he's riding the rocket successfully in our version of the story. Another feature in the movie I liked was, I don't know if you remember a brief scene where Lilo and Stitch are looking through a couple of postcards. I think Stitch ends up basically flipping through them to figure out which cities he wants to invade, and then ends up throwing them at a passing dog or something. I decided I wanted to include some postcards in our model, so there I am folding some paper clips into the rough shape of a postcard holder. I added a little bit more paint then and got that to dry. In the meantime, I wanted to design our postcards. I'm basing my postcard off of a general design I found just in the public domain, but instead of being a postcard from Pentland, I decided to make it a postcard from the ROE, or the Rock of Eternity. That is a reference to the Elvis movie I've been into so much lately, and I thought it was sort of fitting for this model. If you know this movie at all, the Rock of Eternity is sort of a place that Elvis, as a child and even into his adult life, apparently dreamed about going someday. It's sort of a metaphor for basically the unattainable. I think for him personally, maybe it's a meaningful life, or a lasting place in history, and a little bit of happiness in there too, I hope. That was his Rock of Eternity. I guess everyone's got a different one. These postcards are from the Rock of Eternity because Stitch, his rock is to, fulfill his life purpose, which in the movie, funnily enough, is destroying the world. But still, the metaphor holds true. Another point of the movie that I appreciated came after I'd done a little research. Apparently, B.B. King and Little Richard had differing views on Elvis's music. So the former B.B. King thought of his music as being colorless, as he put it, which basically is his way of saying he didn't see anything wrong with Elvis taking a lot of the themes and sounds from primarily African American music and using it to his own ends. B.B. King didn't have a problem with that. Little Richard, on the other hand, thought it was, I guess, what today would call more cultural appropriation, which Elvis has been accused of by some. And so Little Richard felt that it was really black music that Elvis was taking advantage of. One thing I liked after learning that was, back at the theater, I very much appreciated that Baz Luhrmann and the writers of the script decided to keep both of those historical figures in the film. One thing they could have done is say, this is a celebration of Elvis, and so we're going to say no to any haters, historically or otherwise, and we're going to exclude Little Richard from the story just because he's not, a supporter necessarily of Elvis's music. But instead, I think what they did by including Little Richard in the celebration of Elvis was prove their appreciation for all opinions on Elvis. I think it showed a lot of respect to Little Richard, of course, but also of Elvis. They didn't just show you a one-sided person with a public that had a one-sided opinion. Baz Luhrmann really mixed it up, I think, with that simple inclusion of Little Richard. So after hearing that, I really appreciated that he was in the film at all. Once I got those all lined up right, I printed them out. I also have a little picture of Elvis, because also from the movie that Lilo is using to teach Stitch about him. I thought I'd include that in the model as well, so I cut all of those out. Then it was a matter of adding those little lines you see on the back of postcards where you're able to put the to address, so I did that quickly. I wanted to make a sort of base for the model, so I thought about using a paper plate or a cereal box and cut that out to see if that would sort of fit, while at the same time housing the battery pack for the lighting. It ended up not quite working, so I found another box instead. I used some knob pieces, the same that I use at the front of the rocket. I actually use here for feet of the box, the display box, and sort of got the exhaust in there. At that point, I broke the battery pack for those lights, but I thought it ended up looking great anyway, so I wasn't too worried about that. I mentioned in my review how frustrating it was to watch Tom Hanks just as an actor and character in that story, but after a few more viewings, I think I've come to appreciate what he did a little bit more, and he really embodied that character in a way that I wouldn't be surprised if Tom Parker, his character, made it on some lists in the future of honestly all-time movie villains. If you compared him to like how Brando changed his body, his voice, his look completely for The Godfather, he's considered one of the best villains on the screen. Tom Hanks did something very similar, so begrudgingly, I do appreciate the fact that he played that character so well. I covered that box with some fabric my mother recently picked up, and so I kind of wrapped it, stapled it crudely, and put our rocket on top to see how she would fit. Now, I wanted to use paint, but we don't have any that besides that white there that you saw earlier. So instead, I thought I'd use crayons, a sort of crayon melting technique I saw for the first time probably a decade ago. I was going to use these crayons from my niece, who's in the practice of breaking them in half so that they're a little harder to use anyway. But don't worry, we also have a backup box for her, so she'll be just fine when she comes over to hang out. I had to separate the reds, yellows, and oranges from the rest of the colors because I thought I'd use those to sort of get that red-orangey look of the rocket in the movie. Then I got out the old hairdryer. In fact, it was the fact that the hairdryer was out that even gave me the idea in the first place, and I tried to melt the crayons over the rocket. But ever impatient, I decided for a quicker method. That method was to melt them over the stovetop. I put a little water in the pan to start and then some tin foil over that. I believe this is a method at least for melting chocolate, and I thought they were sort of similar. And so I was starting with the reds and got those melting while I was shucking the rest of the crayons. While I knew the wax wasn't going to cover the rocket completely, I still thought it did a good job in sort of representing the fact that we're in an imaginary land at this point. Obviously within a fictional story, but this is what Stitch wishes was happening at that time. So I thought that those liberties could be taken in that sense. And anyway, if Stitch's rocket's going light speed, maybe it makes perfect sense for some of the color to appear to be melting off into the exhaust. With a spoon, I applied the paint. Once it was ready, I was adding postcards, sort of sticking those to the rocket with the wax. Once the red was used up, I added some that orange color instead, got that melted down while I shucked the yellows, or, depapered the yellows. Got the orange all in place and the rest of those note cards. And then last it was the yellows, which did a nice job of blending with the orange and red to give me a nice, rich, but variant on orange color. By this point, I realized that instead of that tame Stitch I picked out at first, I wanted a cooler version that I always preferred when I was playing with these toys anyway. That's Stitch with his little laser gun. So I did find that, and he was looking great. I thought that was fitting anyway, since this is, how Stitch saw the scene going, or would have liked that rocket to work. So he probably would have imagined himself with some of those laser guns or something. Then I was ready to show off. I was pretty happy with how this ended up. Thought it looked pretty cool, and I think it would have made Stitch proud. We have him crammed in the rocket there with Lilo and a rolled up poster of Elvis. Wherever these two characters are headed, I figured they'd want to take Elvis with, and it would be fitting for the king to end up at the Rock of Eternity anyway. Thank you for watching. Like the last model video, this one is brought to you by the Zodiac Dozen, my new book series about a bunch of middle schoolers who find out they have superpowers and have to use those powers to save the world. We got 4 out so far. There's going to be 12 eventually, coming out monthly, and each focusing on a different character with different powers based on their star sign. So if you're interested in that, I'll link it in the description. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed.